Welcome everyone to the What Works virtual forum. My name is Michael Green. I'm the CEO of the Social Progress Imperative, putting on this event in partnership with our friends at Cognitio. So glad you could join us from wherever you are in the world, lots and lots of people. And while we just wait for a few people to join us, let's warm up with a little opinion poll to get the pulse of the room. This is what we want to know. Which one of these things do you miss most during the COVID-19 pandemic? Going to live sports events? Getting my hair cut? Going to restaurants or bars? Going to the office if you must? Is it the movie theater? Is it the gym? Or is it sending your kids to school or daycare? Please vote now. Tell us what life is like under lockdown and what are you missing the most? And here we go. It's the bars, it's the restaurants and bars. This is the impact of COVID on the lives of the participants of this event. It's the fact that you can't go out to bars and restaurants is what's hitting you most. Wow, what an agreeable bunch of people we all are. Thank you everyone for joining us. The COVID crisis evolves and changes all the time. We're still living through a health crisis, but increasingly it's getting more complex. There's a health crisis and an economic crisis transformed together. And I think from our perspective at Social Progress Imperative, a critical part of the story has got to be, it's not just about the health or the health of our nations and our communities and the economies of our nations and our communities, but it's got to be about social progress as well. How do we manage this crisis in a way where no one is left behind, where people are included, where people are really supported, and we address some of the injustices and inequities in our world, not make them worse. So the point of this conversation is, as always, to bring together experts together with practitioners to really share ideas and thoughts about what we can do. Very importantly, I want to say a great big thank you to the people who are supporting this event. Deloitte, Amazon Web Services, the Icelandic Prime Minister's Office, the University of Iceland and IQ Business, and a big recognition again to our partners in this, Cognitio, whose representative Rosbjørn Jonsdottir is here on the line, on the call. So over the next hour and a half or so, we are going to kick off by looking at some data. Social Progress Imperative is a data-driven organization. And I'm delighted I've got a couple of colleagues who are going to share some insights on this challenge of how and when to reopen economies from Central America and then California. And then we've got a terrific panel of experts who I'll come and introduce when we get to there to share their perspectives from different sectors of business, but also from other perspectives as well, thinking about this challenge of how do we reopen and rebuild in an inclusive way. And then we'll be opening up for discussion, drawing on the wealth of expertise that's on this call. So let's kick off, first of all, with my colleague, Jaime Garcia. Jaime is based at the Inca Business School in Costa Rica and is also our regional director for Central America. And Jaime, you've been doing some fascinating work working with a number of governments across Central America, looking at this question about when and how to reopen the economies and how to do that in an inclusive way. So Jaime, I'd love you to share some of your thoughts and ideas about the situation and what the data is telling us.
Thank you, Michael. What we have done here in Central America, specifically working with the government of Costa Rica, with Panama, with El Salvador and Guatemala, is try to develop a strategy using data to tackle the big issue. What is the big issue? Of course, it's COVID, but this is beyond just a health problem. Specifically in the region, specifically in Latin America, we are seeing that we are against a lot of systemic risks. We have problems with the education system. We have problems of bankruptcy for some firms, for some sectors. We have also an issue with the government, with the capabilities of giving better policies. We have bottlenecks in some infrastructure sectors. We have also some production sectors. So this is a systemic crisis. So what we are doing is first help the countries to tackle using data and control the COVID-19, avoid the spread of this. But also what we need to think about is keep the health system, but opening the national economy. We can keep the lockdown for many months, weeks, or months. So what we need to do is open the economy in a safe way. minimize the extent possible of falling production, the increase in unemployment, which is another pandemic that is affecting our social progress, our economic growth, and also regain the confidence between sectors of society. We have seen that in the region, the discussion has been focusing only on health, but not in the social and economic impacts of the crisis. So what we are doing, and this is just as you said, we are data experts. So we developed an opening index to help the governments to tackle the issue of which sectors open and why. So we use a very easy tool based on the risk of a contagion, the economic impact and the social impact of economic activities. And what we developed is something that others strategies are not taking into account, which is the social impact. We want to track and minimize the social costs, focus efforts and resources just on the populations that need it more, and also using the data from the Social Progress Index, the 3 dimensions of basic human needs, foundations of well-being and opportunity, to develop a tool that helps us to measure the resilience of the workers. For example, the individual characteristics of the workers, the household conditions, which we also need to take into account, the local context of the communities, and of course, the economic activity that we are measuring. With this data and with this framework, what we use is some indicators from the ministries of health from the different countries. We use, of course, GDP proportion and employment proportion of the economic activities, but also we check, for example, with households without water, which in region is very important. Households without internet, we can go to home office if we don't have access to internet. Average years of education of women, we have seen in social progress that if we invest in women education, we're going to have more opportunities, but also this helps to have more resilience in terms of following the instruction of Ministry of Health. And also households with overcrowding, the conditions of the households also affect the risk of contagion. And we did this for 54 economic activities for each country. We developed clusters of risk according to this. So in this way, with this information, we were able to generate basic protocols, low intermediate protocols, strong intermediate protocols, and harder protocols for each different economic activity. So in that way, we can develop a strategy applying these specific protocols according to the risk and taking into account what's happening with the social impact of the populations. Because, for example, in construction, maybe you have, and the data shows that the population that is working in construction, they have more problems with internet access or access to water or low education. However, in teaching, in education sector, we have a better population in terms of tackling the lockdown and also to follow the instruction of the Ministry of Health. So in this way, the government can focus on specific activities and specific regions. And we know that in this new normality, the economic performance is tied to the performance of the virus. So what we need is to dance with the virus and open with a strategy that can help us to localize the new actions and how to tackle specifically to these populations that are in the risk of contagion, but also in the risk of having problems in terms of their social progress and social welfare. These protocols, you can apply it by different region, and also the data can help us to identify the specific support that some employees need when their activity is closed. We can control also and guide the safe operation of the value chains. And this is really important for tourism. In Central America, we have a high dependence on tourism. In Costa Rica, it's almost 8% of GDP. So how to open again this sector, but understanding what are the different risks of the different sectors that are part of the value chain of this. And also to understand that tourism, for example, is generating a lot of employment for women, is generating employment for people that is living in rural environments, and also is generating jobs for migrants. So the idea is to protect the traveler, the worker, and the community, but tackling the strategy along all the value chain. So this is how we are using the data and how we are guiding the different governments to use data to tackle the COVID, but also the social impacts in a region that needs a lot of protection in terms of social progress.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jaime. And let's turn to my colleague Justin Edwards, who'll talk about some work that's also been done now in California. And then maybe we can look at some of the similarities between these pieces of work, and if there are any questions, we can pick those up then. And Jaime, I'd love to come back to you to tell us a bit more about some of the practical choices that countries like Costa Rica are facing at this time. But Justin, over to you. Tell us, Justin Edwards, our North America Director, tell us about the work you've been doing in California with San Mateo County.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Jaime. Yeah, I think there are a couple questions, that we're focusing on here in the U.S., much like Jaime pointed out, and many other communities and societies around the globe. Currently, we're working in a number of different regions across the U.S. We've started to test an idea on how we can sort of investigate some of the economic data and marry it with a bit of this social, sort of landscaping to better understand vulnerability, both from a sort of residential standpoint or an individual standpoint in a community, as well as from a workplace standpoint. This is something that we've tested looking at each census tract across San Mateo County. I know some of our partners are on the call here today. And essentially what we really wanted to do was, how do we better sort of tease out from an individual perspective, where are these most people that are most vulnerable, right, to the reopening of society and their economy, either because of the social dynamics of their home or because of the way that their workplace actually conducts their core business, and does that make them actually more vulnerable? Now, I've provided a couple of definitions here. I hope you can read them, but I'll just sort of quickly say, a residential vulnerability assessment is really assessing whether or not a community possesses the dynamics to continue to work in a very safe and isolated, risk-free from contagion, very similar to what Jaime was indicating from that, health perspective. Now, workplace vulnerability, really we're looking for job clusters or types of industry and sectors where, perhaps you're an essential worker working in a healthcare environment, that would put you at a higher risk. Places, nightclubs, security or bartenders or service folks working in like nightclubs or large crowded venues, high contact areas would sort of scale you up at a higher level of vulnerability. So why are we trying to do this? Both from, two different perspectives. We know that, COVID has really exacerbated a lot of the underlying social sort of inequities that we have in our communities. It has continued to exacerbate a lot of the economic inequality that we have in our communities. But it's also really catapulting people who previously were not, let's say, economically vulnerable. It's cascading them into this new territory where, this is new territory for them. This is an area where they may not be familiar with how to navigate the social system and any of the benefits that might be available. These are areas where folks are, being forced to make really kind of life-altering decisions in this kind of a vacuum of, what if I can't go back to work in 3 months? What if I can't go back to work in 6 months? What if my industry or my sector is completely destroyed? So what we're trying to do is like spotlight how we can identify some of these most vulnerable people. You just kind of look at the data that we're looking at here. We're continuing to refine this in, obviously, in San Mateo and elsewhere, we're going to apply this approach. And one of the points I think that has been made very, very clear also, and those, familiar who work with data and actually interact with, community stakeholders, is we're only looking at the people that the data already captures. And the data inherently misses out on some of those most vulnerable populations already. So there are a significant number of people that are invisible in these data landscaping assessments. And I think it's critical then, how we can develop strategies to engage with community-based organizations, engage with faith institutions, neighborhood associations, civic associations, others who can actually sort of really connect, a stakeholder, a resource, a stimulus package, et cetera, with a very vulnerable individual or community itself. When we think about that by sector, you think about folks working in the agricultural sector who oftentimes are undocumented and who really, really need, let's say, cash in a moment like this right now. You have people who are working in sort of tourism sectors right now. Those are the people that we really want to be able to prioritize, obviously, addressing and investing in this current moment. So, this approach is being sort of refined. I think it fits nicely and dovetails with kind of the overarching framework that Jaime presented in how we can actually build unique strategies by sector. And I would also like to even think about developing unique strategies by sort of characteristics of communities based on individual sort of risk assessments as well from a residential perspective.
Thank you so much, Justin. I think a point you made about how we've got this crisis and this emergency. It's new, it's novel. We're trying to respond, but to have a really effective response, you've got to be able to break it down by different industrial sectors, by different communities. And unless you can target that way, whether you're targeting health support, welfare support, small business support, it's got to be really, really granular and informed by data and driven in that way. Let's I think it's time and have a little poll, I think. So we've got another question for you all to reflect on, which I think to frame our discussion coming up in a moment. So what worries you more right now? We've had the COVID crisis to deal with, the health crisis, but now increasingly there's what concerns about economic growth and unemployment. We know that there's distributional impacts of this. Inequity and injustice has driven some of the health impacts, but we also know how we tackle this is going to really affect inequality. And then lurking, of course, in the background, still a huge challenge for humanity, is climate change. So what's worrying you right now? Let us know what you think. There we go, 5, 4, last chance to vote. 3, 2, 1. Polls closed. Share the results. There we go. Interesting. So what's really concerning people the most at the moment is inequality, then economic growth and unemployment, and the health issues are only coming in third amongst this audience. So let's see how we feel and hear what our panel has got to say to reflect on these issues and what's on their minds. And maybe we can run the poll again a bit later. We've got a terrific group of people here joining us today to share some insights from great leaders from a number of sectors. And we're going to kick off with Anne Cairns, who's the Vice Chair of MasterCard. Anne, welcome. I mean, MasterCard in some sense is so much part of the nervous system or the circulatory system of the global economy. So you've got a fantastic perspective on the challenges that are being faced and the different solutions that are being applied. So Anne, from MasterCard's perspective, how are you seeing this issue around the reopening of economies and how do we do that effectively?
Well, I think that you're completely right, and the other two speakers are as well, that what we really need to be thinking about right now is having very good data that really guides us when we're opening up. Obviously, there's the medical data, but in our industry, we're also looking at the financial data, and we're working with many governments around the world to help them assess what's going on. What we've actually seen is that there was a big move away from cash in the last 100 days. And you've seen things like consumers adopting e-com because obviously people are buying online. And just to give you an example of that shift, last year, the Americans spent $600 billion online. But in May this year, year over year, they actually had a 93% increase. So they almost doubled the amount they were spending online, which is probably no surprise to anyone. At the same time, what we've seen in this process is that people don't want to be handling cash if they can avoid it. And so they're moving very rapidly into using contactless payments. Europe is the most active continent in the world in that respect. And when we've interviewed people in Europe, they've told us that 64% of them have said that now that tap and pay, they're just going to stick with that. They're not going to revert to the original way that they paid. And so around the world, we're seeing a shift to digital. And of course, this really hurts companies, particularly local SMEs and so on, that may not be online competing with the big marketplaces such as Amazon. And so the need for small businesses to digitize themselves in order to be able to survive in the future is becoming very critical. And so inside MasterCard, we're doing things such as developing a war chest of $250 million that we're investing in small and medium-sized businesses around the world. And we're starting off in this particular time by offering them free cybersecurity services so that they can bring themselves up online and be protected free of charge. It's this kind of thing that we think will reinvigorate the economy as we open up.
Great. Thanks, Anne. And what about, and this question around inclusion, what can be done to drive as inclusive a process as possible to ensure that it's not just big business, but small business and the businesses that really have the most social impact? I think Jaime talked about the role of construction workers versus those in the education sector. And Justin talked about some of the, perhaps undocumented people being most vulnerable. How are you thinking about supporting that process?
Yeah, well, back in 2015, we actually made a pledge that we would bring an extra 500 million people into the financial system by 2020. And actually, we hit those targets. And now we've actually extended that pledge to say we're going to go for the next 500 million. We're actually going to have, by the end of 2025, brought in 1 billion people into the financial system. How do we do it? Well, most people in most countries have some sort of connection with their government. And, if you're a farmer, you're receiving farming subsidies. If you're a parent, you might be receiving child subsidies, or you might be a pensioner. Many different ways of actually receiving money from governments. And that has been a lifeline in order to actually digitize this money and get it into the hands of people who need it the most, who are perhaps not connected to the financial system, had no means of accepting money like this before, but had a telephone, or were able to have access to things like offline card services. And of course, once we started doing that, then we also have the capacity to use the chip technology to start thinking of much broader applications. And the chip technology can do things like hold health records. So it might be, a natural extension to actually offer things like wellness passes or health passes, which can actually monitor whether people have been vaccinated, for example, which could be very good if we ever have a vaccine in the future for this pandemic, but equally good for all the vaccines that are needed today for just ordinary conditions that we've lived with for years. So you can see that by combining the financial data and the health data and working with governments and connecting them to their citizens, there's a big opportunity to increase both financial inclusion and welfare.
It's like there's sort of the technology available to us. If we can get it right, the opportunity to really target and focus interventions on the right people is incredibly powerful. And that's one of the opportunities in this crisis.
Absolutely, big opportunity. And last thing I'd say is that, if you've got a mobile phone, you've got to be able to charge it. So if you're somewhere in Africa, you've got to hook up with solar power panel providers and so on. You've got to think of the infrastructure, building the infrastructure at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. We did some work looking at the sort of what we call social resilience to epidemic diseases. And this thing about it's a range of different factors, and things like water and sanitation and infrastructure like electricity are all part of this picture. And so actually these sort of broad aspects of social progress are part of that deeper resilience to epidemic diseases.
Correct.
Thank you, Anne. We'll come back in a moment. I'd like to now to Helene Gale, who is President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust. Helene, you're also a great expert in epidemics, having worked for the Centers for Disease Control for many years as well. Could I perhaps, maybe, I think it's irresistible that one has to ask you with your expertise to offer us a comment on how you think the health response in the US is going at the moment. I think we've all seen the headlines, the way infections are increasing. Could I maybe just first, Helene, any reflections on how that response has gone and where is it going in the US at the moment?
Well, thanks so much. And great to be with everybody. You know, obviously it's a very mixed picture, and it's a mixed picture because unfortunately we have not had a response in a coordinated national way that would have been optimal. And so, you know, we're a nation of 50 states, and 50 done on their own, made their own plans largely, you know, and I think it does reflect, you know, the reality that we have not had the kind of overarching national coordination that would normally happen under these circumstances. And having, you know, as you mentioned, worked on with the Centers for Disease Control for a couple of decades and have seen many different epidemics come and go. Obviously, this is different than anything else we've ever faced as a global community. Nonetheless, you know, it is critical to have a more unified response than we've had. But I think in some ways, what it has allowed us to see is the different range of responses and what's been most effective. And so, you know, we're seeing across the country states that are starting to have a resurgence because they probably opened up their economies too fast or too aggressively, and now starting to see increases where a lot of the states that have maintained the public health measures and reopened economies slower have not seen that same sort of uptick. So I think we're in some ways, although this would not be the preferred way to have the data to demonstrate what works and what doesn't work, we are getting a sense of that given kind of the mosaic of responses across the country. And, you know, I think as several people have highlighted earlier, this is one of the most complicated pandemics we face because this interface between a health crisis that has caused us to have an economic crisis because of the measures that we have to put in place, I think makes the decision-making all that much more complicated than it would for a regular pandemic or epidemic.
Thank you, Helene. I've been told off on chat that was a mean question, so I apologize.
Oh, it's not a mean question at all.
But let's turn a bit now to, I mean, your role now with the Chicago Community Trust. So you've got a clear focus on the city of Chicago. How are you thinking about what COVID means for your work and your, the role of the Community Trust and driving, improvements in the lives of people in Chicago? How are you fitting this all together?
Yeah, so just as a backdrop, the Chicago Community Trust is the community foundation for Chicago and the metropolitan area. And when I came a couple of years ago, we stepped back to think about, given our mission to work with communities for the most challenging issues that the region faces, we thought we would step back and look at how we could make the biggest difference. And, while Chicago, like so many urban areas, has a multitude of challenges, we have a major problem with violence. We have one of the largest life expectancy gaps in the nation. We have challenges with access to healthcare, access to quality education, et cetera. But we felt that underlying all of this was this issue of wealth inequality that in Chicago particularly is very much linked to a history of racial and ethnic segregation. And so we said that our priority would be tackling the issue of the racial and ethnic wealth gap because it was such an important factor for the overall economy that has our population is 2/3 African American and Latinx. And so if those populations aren't doing well, that has a huge impact on the economy. But we also realize that that wealth gap had such a huge impact on health, on education, on safety, et cetera. So that we came into this crisis with that focus, and then COVID really amplified those issues and highlighted the inequity, because in Chicago, again, not unlike many cities around the nation, Black and Latinx populations have been the most impacted, both from a health standpoint, but also economically. So we went into this recognizing that as we responded to this crisis, we were going to have to make sure we were looking at the populations that were already so vulnerable and making sure we put resources into those communities. We launched a major response fund. We raised about $60 million overall for the city and for the state, and then worked quickly to get those resources out to the communities that were most hard hit, focusing on food, shelter, cash to people, and really working in the most vulnerable communities, primarily through community-based organizations that were best positioned to meet the needs of those communities. So, you know, I guess I would just say overall, given the fact that we had already started on a focus that looked at wealth inequity, that this crisis exacerbated and in some ways made more urgent some of the work that we had already started on, and the work that we will continue on as we think of going from responding to this crisis to looking at economic recovery.
Great. Thank you very much, Helene. Now, I'm not sure if anyone else is having some gremlins with the video, but you came through loud and clear there, Helene. Just to quickly to ask is, I mean, how do you see the next phase in Chicago?
Well, I think, you know, what we really want to make sure that we're able to focus on is having an equitable recovery. When we look back on the data from the Great Recession and look at populations, you know, while the white population in Chicago recovered well, Black and Latinx populations have still not recovered from the Great Recession. And so when we go into this recovery, we want to make sure that a focus on equity and inclusive growth is a huge part of that focus. So we're really looking at how we work across government, philanthropy, and the private sector to mount a response that really does put equity at the center, so that those communities that have been left behind historically won't be left behind as we think about the recovery, and that we really put a particular emphasis on small businesses in Black and brown communities, looking at job placement programs, education, digital and broadband access for children who have been out of school, et cetera. So really looking at what are the things that will help make sure that we have an equitable recovery as we look at moving forward from now.
Right. Thank you very much. And I know that inclusive growth is a big agenda, I know, for MasterCard, so I'm sure Anne will want to come back on comment that in a moment. So we've had a look at a geographical story for Chicago. Let's maybe turn now to a sector. And we're glad to have Gloria Guevara from the World Travel and Tourism Council joining us, which we know is a sector that's been hugely impacted by the crisis. So Gloria, thank you so much for making time to join us. Well, it must be a crazy time for you. How are you thinking about the recovery of the travel and tourism sector? And particularly, how does it recover in a way that is going to boost inclusion while also protecting people's health? Gloria.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the invitation. And before I talk about the recovery, and I hope I don't have problems with my video because I saw you like a little bit blurry. Let me just put in context and the situation and talking about a little bit about social impact. WTTC represents the private sector. Over 200 CEOs are our members, and 30% of them are Europe, 30% in Asia, 30% in America, 10% in the rest of the world. This organization was created 30 years ago, and one of the things that we do is quantify the economic impact of travel tourism. As you see in this data, travel and tourism contributes to 10% of the global GDP. In the last 20 years, we have grown significant. And for the last 9 years, our growth has outpaced the growth of the economy. And last year, of course, was not an exception. It was 3.5 versus 2.5. What's interesting is that the jobs that we create, 330 million jobs, that's basically 1 out of 10. And when you look at all the sectors around the world, all the industries, in the last 5 years, 1 out of 4 jobs that were created in the world were in our sector. Now, what's fascinating also talking about inclusion is that 50% women. In the G20 is 50%. When you look at the other countries, it's actually a little bit higher, it's like 53, 54%, compared to a 43% employment. And a lot of these women are in SMEs, of course, and of course in the corporate world, but in SMEs, they are like the owners of the businesses, the owners of the travel agencies or the restaurants or whatever is the case, as we represent, as I say, multiple industries. Very interesting also, 30% youth, which is one of the sectors that provides a lot of opportunities for young people. Very inclusive also. You will find representation pretty much from every religion, every group, everything. It gives opportunities regardless of your education. Now, it's interesting of what Jaime was mentioning in terms of the social economic impact, because we have seen in the destinations that travel and tourism help us to reduce poverty, help us to increase education, and help us to protect wildlife, of course, and culture. And the left side, you have there, as an example, some countries that heavily their GDP depend on travel and tourism as the main economic activity. So it is very important, and nowadays when we are living in this situation, of course, there are a lot of countries around the world, especially a lot of developing countries, that they are suffering the most. In the next slide, you will find the impact, and this is the last one. We work very closely with Oxford Economics and multiple players and knowledge partners around the world to quantify the impact. And unfortunately, nothing is similar to what we're living. This is 5 or 6 times the worst that we had last time, which is 2008 financial crisis. In the current scenario, there are a little bit over 121 million jobs impacted. And think about that half of those, of course, are women. 3.4 trillion American trillion, so $3,400 billion. But what's very sad is that this number can almost double, as you will see here, if we don't make the right decisions, if we don't work public and privately, and the collaboration, and also among countries. Justin mentioned, for instance, the help for the sectors, and what we have not seen, unfortunately, in a lot of countries is the support to specifically travel and tourism. We have seen support, for instance, to SMEs, but SMEs in sectors that are surviving, but SMEs in travel and tourism that are more complicated, that have been more vulnerable, we haven't seen that. And also what Anne mentioned in the terms of the digital agenda is one that has been accelerated. And of course, the financial inclusion is very important. So this is my last slide, but to your point about the recovery, we like to learn from the experience in the past. And we analyzed 90 different situations where we were impacted from 9/11, 2008, and we came up with 4 principles. We need to have a coordination, public and private coordination, and among countries. Like the UK, we have the quarantines, for instance, they're gonna announce when and how we're gonna open, but it's still uncertain. And because of this uncertainty, is impacting the sector. And yes, this is the largest region of the world in travel and tourism, and the summer is the most important season, but the social impact and the economic impact can be even greater if we don't have that coordination. So 2008, we were very good, and probably Anne knows this better, but the coordination between the financial sector and the public sector was great. And we were able to get out of that crisis, and the impact for tourism recovered in average 18 months. Difference with 9/11, where it took 4 years because of the different protocols that we implemented around the world. And that's why now at WTTC, we're talking about protocols. Wearing a mask, very important in all the flights. Make sure that we have certain measures in place, and there are standards throughout the world, so that you can expect the same experience in a hotel here in London or New York, in Milan. And the other thing, our members offer their hotels to doctors and nurses around the world. So we have experience maintaining those premises COVID-free, and that knowledge with the expertise from WHO and CDC was of course included for the protocols that we launched. So The 4 points is the coordination among public and private and among countries, that unfortunately we don't see that a lot. Second is the protocols are very important. Third, to include a component of health to the seamless experience, and mention also about the digital stamp for the vaccine. I fully agree with that. Once we have the vaccine, we need to be able to identify who has that vaccine. Before that vaccine, we need to do testing, contact tracing. For the countries that they are doing that, plus the protocols, we are seeing that they are recovering faster than the ones that they are not following that advice. And of course, to continue the support from the governments is very important, because this is not a switch that you turn on and off and suddenly the hotels are full, the restaurants are full. We need to have some sort of support through the journey so that we can recover faster. So those 4 points are very important, Michael.
I think, Gloria, thank you. I think it's a really important reminder that we can learn from other crises. This crisis is different, but there are things that we can learn, lessons that we can learn, positive and negative. I mean, as Helene said, you know, from the financial crisis, the bounce back wasn't very inclusive. But at least we can learn something and think about how we explicitly address these issues. I was very struck, one of the things you emphasized there was about there's going to be a gender impact. Looking at which sectors are open, how they open, this is going to have potentially huge sort of distributional impacts. How is WTTC thinking about that inclusion agenda? Because obviously you've got a lot of immediate challenges to get the industry going. But how about then making sure that recovery is inclusive?
Well, we're working through our members and the different players, of course, for this inclusion. We're a sector that is very inclusive. We try to, as I say, represent everyone. And what has been a big challenge here is in our engagements with governments, we're trying to make a point about being inclusive and offering support regardless, right? You will see that, for instance, as an example, the travel agencies, they don't have sometimes the assets in order to get liquidity or the loans to survive. However, we try to help them and provide information, and also in our advocacy efforts with governments, so that they'll have this liquidity to go through this storm and in a way weather the storm, no? So in this case, as we know, a lot of businesses, as I say, are owned by women. It's very important to look at all, and also very important in some cases, the big guys. What sometimes people don't understand is the domino effect. Let me give you one example. If a cruise line goes down or the cruise industry goes down, you have 1,000 destinations impacted. 80% of those are in developing countries, and a lot of the businesses that provide those services to the cruise passengers are owned by women, right? Or a lot of youth, or in that case, as I say, the inclusivity is very important. So this health crisis has become, and I think someone mentioned that, economic crisis, and now it's a social crisis, right? Because the fact that people don't have that income, there are children that now have to figure out what to do, because the family now cannot have food on the table, right? And then you have the impact. They're fishing, for instance, fishes that they're illegal, or they're poaching animals in extinction. So the whole domino effect is significant. But of course, to your point, we're working with developing banks and the governments.
Thank you. Yeah, that kind of interconnectedness, and you say the domino effect of seeing how all these things work is going to have huge different repercussions and implications. Thank you, Gloria. And I think it's great that we've got Sharon Thorne, the global chair of Deloitte next. Of course, Deloitte has a very broad global footprint, but also is involved in so many different sectors, not just with business, but also with government as well. Sharon, welcome. So what are you seeing? What are you hearing from Deloitte member firms and from your clients around what can be done to make this recovery inclusive and to make sure we're capturing the distributional issues in managing this crisis? Sharon.
Thank you, Michael. So it's wonderful to be with you all. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a fantastic discussion so far. And obviously, you know, we're seeing the massive impact of COVID in so many areas. And I was very interested in the poll that you did showing people's focus on inequality, 44%, I think, you know, being the first thing people are most worried about, and then the economy. And just thinking about, I suppose, how businesses are responding. And I wanted to talk about, I suppose, the importance of businesses stepping up in this time. And, you know, Deloitte is very, you know, for a long time had a very active voice on issues that matter. And we believe that businesses have to actively collaborate to drive policies and initiatives that seek to improve the well-being of society and to facilitate the inclusive economic growth, inclusive growth that we're all talking about. And in 2013, we became a founding sponsor of the Social Progress Imperative. It's something I'm very proud of, our connection. I sit on the board, and I think it's vital that businesses are supporting NGOs, like the Social Progress Imperative. And we are definitely, lots of people, this was a term from Larry Summers, the sort of former US Treasury Secretary, talking about this being a hinge in history. And it's a huge opportunity and responsibility. And as businesses, organizations begin to emerge from COVID, and as economies begin to reopen, I think businesses have three main responsibilities, and that's supporting the new world in their local communities, obviously re-engaging with their customers and responding to the needs of their employees. And as we move into recovery, I think leaders have got to be resilient. We're talking a lot about resilience, but people, leaders have to be. We also have to be inclusive, and we have to truly value diversity. We're all going through this period of great reflection, and there's an opportunity to redefine the role of business. But we do have to ensure that organizations are successful. So you've got to balance this. Because without success and without businesses focusing on achieving success, then they're not going to have the financial muscle to make a difference. But it is really importantly refocusing purpose and values to be at the heart of recovery and driving forward social progress. And we've been underlining the inequalities and injustices that COVID is exacerbating. We've referenced gender, race, but there's also LGBT plus and disability. And I do think that businesses have a key role to play in ensuring that all of these issues are being addressed as we move through what we refer as recover and into thrive and the sort of the next normal. And we've got to, as we emerge, consider the social progress measures that will underpin our ability to thrive in the new normal. And of course, you've referenced climate. It's a massive challenge, and I guess there are just so many big challenges, but I'm surprised it wasn't higher up the list actually, Michael, because it's an existential threat to humanity. And there's an opportunity as we come out of COVID for companies to use the regeneration that they're doing as a springboard for action. And not just companies, governments are saying that they see these challenges as intrinsically linked to the recovery. And recently, the UK Business Secretary made an address that was tying in the COVID-19 recovery, the climate emergency, and collaboration with financial investors all together. So it's sort of that's critical that lots of different people are working together. And as I say, we need purpose-led businesses more than ever, and businesses putting recovery of their communities at the heart of what they're doing, the health of their employees, but also trust of their customers, and focusing on those alongside their profitability and balance sheets. And just picking up that trust point, we published a millennial survey last week, which shows that whilst most millennials and Gen Z are generally pleased with their own employers' actions, overall they don't believe business as a whole has a positive impact on society. So we've got to build solutions that all stakeholders can trust, working together with government and NGOs. And it's really critical that we rebuild that trust. And it may mean that we have to rebuild more slowly, with a focus on resilience rather than being rapid. And in my role as chair of our global board, one of the key things I think boards have a responsibility to do is to really push long-term thinking. And it's one of the challenges where you have, CEOs and leadership teams that are going to turn over more quickly. We've got to keep saying we've got to think about the longer term and ensuring that we're focused on that. And it could mean business models have got to change quite dramatically. And as I talked about, that link to climate as well, we've got to really focus on long-term success and ensuring we're learning the lessons from COVID, because it's clear that a lot of businesses haven't been resilient enough. But however it's done, we really do have to ensure that we leave a better world for the next generation.
Thanks, thanks, Sharon. I think that, thank you for putting climate change on the agenda. So I too was surprised how low it came down in the poll. And I guess one thing we're kind of hopeful about is that we can, in the response to COVID, have demonstrated that we can tackle some of these problems. Can I just ask you, I mean, two things. One is, there's often a lot of skepticism when business says, we're changing, we're taking these things seriously. So, I mean, what would you point to say that there's a real shift in how business is thinking about this in response to COVID around its social responsibility to communities? And I also wanted to ask about a point that Gloria made around, you know, the relationship between government and business, the importance of coordination, and how you're seeing that across the global network of Deloitte.
Okay, so two very good questions. You know what? People will remember, hopefully people remember, when Davos was happening, there was a lot of talk about stakeholder capitalism. And in the US, the Business Roundtable, over 100 CEOs signed a statement, again, sort of focusing on stakeholder capitalism. And it is this commitment, not just to, you know, shareholders, but to the wider community, to employees, to a much, you know, the sort of the whole stakeholder environment for companies. So companies are definitely talking about it, committing to it. And as part of that, you know, at Davos, there were a lot of commitments to climate. A lot of companies have been committing to addressing inclusion. Interestingly, there's been, I would say, quite a lot of progress in some areas around gender. But what's been clear with some of the issues that have come out from the Black Lives Matter movement is that although progress has been made in some areas around minority ethnic communities in business, that there hasn't been enough progress made around Black people. And so I would say that lots of businesses are reflecting on that at the moment. Deloitte is absolutely, we've been engaging with our people to understand the challenges they're facing, and we're putting in place actions to address this. And I think, you know, Mike, the challenge for businesses, because everything is so transparent now with social media, you know, so and your employees can post things, particularly if you have disgruntled employees when they leave you. If companies are not living what they say their purpose is, it becomes clear very quickly, and you will lose out. So lots of businesses have direct consumer relationships. It's less like that for someone like Deloitte. But if you say that you're going to do something, you do have to do it. And I think that is helping to drive real change, and which is fantastic. And also lots of leaders now really believe that we have to make a difference, or, you know, climate is an existential threat. If we don't address that, then, you know, people are talking about a dead planet, and that's the reality. So businesses are stepping up. I know, I honestly believe that. And I think that COVID will give them an opportunity to do more. In terms of government and business working together, you know, in the UK, the government has reached out to us. We've been working with them you know, on a number of projects directly supporting them, but also just sharing a lot of thought leadership. And we're doing it, you know, we've got a lot of thought leadership on our website, which is available to all of anyone who wants to look at it, but also just, you know, sharing best practice, supporting government, and thinking how, you know, we can transform the economy going forward, transform communities and support people. So there is a lot of activity that's happening in different member firms with the different governments supporting them, and it is critical. And it's all of us. I mean, we were on the panel in Davos, Michael, where we talked about how critical it is that, you know, business, government, and the community works together. And actually, one of the great things that, you know, we talk about Deloitte is the superpower of our people, because if we get them focused on doing the right things, on, for example, responsible choices around climate, on inclusion, creating an inclusive culture, you know, those 300,000+ people can have a massive impact, not just at Deloitte, but externally as well.
Thanks, Shani. You've got a lot of assets available there. Thank you very much. I think that we've had a great question that's come in from Najwa Yunus, who's asked about this question about, okay, we can talk about all this inclusive growth stuff, but if businesses are just trying to survive, is that going to get pushed aside in favor ahead of these other issues? And MasterCard's had done a lot of work in this whole area of inclusive growth. How do you see business facing up to this, existential threat on the commercial side, but then also the pressure to be doing more socially? How do businesses manage that?
Well, I think that it very much depends on what position you're in. So if you're one of these businesses that has an extremely strong balance sheet, and you're in a digital growth area, and I'm thinking of, well, for example, MasterCard's in that sort of situation, then you can really follow a model of altruistic capitalism. I mean, I agree with Sharon that this is a great opportunity for business to redefine its role, and that there is a hunger out there for businesses to do this. But as you rightly point out, and I think we saw it very much from the presentation that Gloria gave, that in the tourist industry, businesses are really, on the brink of, not being able to survive. And many of them are small businesses. And I was actually intrigued, Gloria, by the 50% women in the G20. I didn't know it was that high in the G20. And this is where I think that the whole coordination that she's talking about, the government intervention, which we've seen happening across most parts of the world now, are really needed. But it's also where I think that the big businesses that have the resilience to do this should be stepping up to help those customers that are their small businesses to actually survive. And we've seen this happening, for example, in the banking sector in Britain. Now, admittedly, it started to really happen when the government came in and said, we're actually going to be the backstop for loans that you give to businesses. And that was actually pushed by Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England. But really, if you think about it, the banks should have been thinking about this themselves for their own SME portfolios, because if those SME portfolios fold, the impact on the bank's business is absolutely huge. So I think really recognizing how interdependent we are, not independent, and thinking of our businesses in that way is the right way forward. And by the way, in terms of the financial crisis in 2008, what I would say about that is that we learned then how to survive. The financial industry did massive investment between 2008 and now. And what you see now is the capital markets are actually performing without a blip, even though we've gone into negative oil prices, even though volumes have doubled, tripled, quadrupled on any particular day. And it's almost the opposite of what we've actually done in places like our hospitals. And so we were able to cope with the financial side of the crisis very well in the West, but we're really not able to cope with the health side of the crisis because we haven't had the Eastern experience of the MERS and the SARS and all of those sort of things that would have caused us to invest in our infrastructure to cope with a pandemic. So it's pretty ironic, really.
Each crisis is different and trying to catch up all the time. Helene, can I ask you from your position in Chicago to think about how's business stepping up in Chicago and how you're coordinating with business as part of this response?
Yeah, so, one of the wonderful things about Chicago is that it has one of the most collaborative relationships between business, philanthropy, and government. And so, businesses in Chicago have really stepped up in a major way. As an example, as I mentioned, we mounted 2 emergency response funds, one for Chicago and then one for the state of Illinois. And the contributions from business were a huge part of that. And so, business has really stepped up in terms of providing resources. But I think, again, thinking about this notion of how do we come out of this recovery in a way that really focuses on equity, businesses are also very, very engaged in discussions around that. We have some of the most unequal home lending practices in the country, as an example. A study was just released that showed that in single neighborhoods that are predominantly white in Chicago, mortgage lending is larger than all of Black neighborhoods in Chicago put together. So one white neighborhood more than all the Black neighborhoods in Chicago put together in terms of mortgage lending. And we know that lending is, particularly home lending, mortgages and home ownership, is a huge wealth creator. And that speaks to a lot of the issues that we're dealing with inequities. All that to say, and it kind of relates to what Sharon was talking about, businesses are now saying, we get it. This is no longer acceptable. We can't have these practices that knowingly or unknowingly contribute to inequality in our region. And we're seeing businesses say, we've seen the data. We are now going to really look at our practices in ways that, we think can really have a huge impact, more than dollar contributions from their philanthropic side. It's really how are businesses thinking about changing their practices so that these issues that have been so systemic and have disproportionately locked some out of economic opportunities are no longer the way that businesses will practice. So we really are very optimistic that between COVID and the aftermath of George Floyd murder, that there is a different thought about how businesses should use their role to contribute to greater economic equity.
Thanks, Lily. I think that echoes something Sharon was saying around transparency and the way that businesses realize they are being watched and they have to respond to this. And that so actually the pressure on businesses can potentially really make a difference, and there's an opportunity. And optimism is very welcome at this time.
And I think it just goes back to the same point that you've been making, that having data really can drive decisions. And the more that we have data, the more we can hold all different stakeholders responsible and accountable for creating the kind of society that we want to see.
I agree, Helene. And at MasterCard, we'd worked with Pullman in Chicago and the local authority there to look at the investment they were doing in the local community. And we were able to see through the payment flows and the way that people changed their spending habits, the rise in actually prosperity in the region as the investment went in. And we also saw something happen. There was a killing there, and there was a dip in spending, consumer confidence and all of that for a little while after that, and then it continued to rise again. I mean, the data is definitely there now.
Yeah, Pullman is one of the great examples of how by building that kind of economic engine, we started seeing drop in violence and so many other social challenges. So I think this notion of how we create economic vibrancy really has such a huge reverberation in so many other ways.
Exactly.
Thank you. Now, there's a question's come in, I think we on the chat, there's something worth flagging to you, Gloria. There's a question about with the vaccines and who has access to the vaccine and that having a whole distributional issue. Gloria, I know you answered that in the chat, but it'd be good just to get your perspective on that.
Yes, we see, again, learning from the past, where we had a couple of outbreaks such as SARS, MERS, and Ebola, we were able to travel without a vaccine, right? Why was that? Because we were able to isolate the people infected. And yes, this virus is different, 80% asymptomatic, and that's when the testing, contact tracing is important. So we see two phases. Once the vaccine is widely available and is spread, yes, that everyone has access to the vaccine, we might need to document who has the vaccine, perhaps for a period of time, and have a digital stamp of that, including your reservation, similar to what we had like 30 years ago with some vaccines that they were needed from when you were traveling. I don't know, you remember the health passport, yellow book that the ICAO had. Now, we believe now it's going to be digital, as Anne mentioned. It's very important to include it in the reservation or include it in your phone or some sort of token or something like that. Now, before the vaccine is available, we can travel. If we think about the past of the SARS, MERS, and Ebola, we were able to travel without a vaccine as long as we can isolate the infected people. And that's what, if you can travel, if there's a testing involved, and that's an international trip. If I don't know if I mentioned, if you go to Iceland, They perform a test on arrival, right? And Iceland has been successful. They haven't had a lockdown, by the way. They implemented the protocols. They perform a test on arrival. They ask you to download an app for contact tracing. And then if you test negative, you can move around the country, and then you need to track where have you been for 2 weeks in case that you test later positive, and they can trace back the sick people. If you test negative, of course, positive, of course, you're isolated. So we need to think about that the vast or the largest amount of population in the world is not infected. Yes, it's a very important and big number that everyone is so concerned that number keeps growing, and it seems that we're not going to be able to stop that sometime soon. However, how do we get to some semi-normal, right? And that's what we are saying. I disagree, for instance, with the passports for immunity. Someone mentioned in the chat, what is a passport for immunity? That if I get a test for antibodies, then I get a stamp or something like that. Because, and going back to inequality, right? If I'm competing with someone for exactly the same job, exactly the same, and we have similar skills, but that person has a passport with antibodies for COVID and I don't, and the job has some sort of interface with people, who do you think is going to be higher? There might be some discrimination there. So we don't believe that the passport for immunities are the solution. That might have some issues with discrimination. We also don't believe that you should share your health information with other countries or authorities, but we believe that you should be okay with the testing on arrival or before departure and the contact tracing. And by the way, those are the countries that they are doing better to recover from in travel and tourism from this situation.
Gloria, don't you think that testing just before you depart is a great thing? Because then, you know, I saw that Lufthansa were doing testing in Frankfurt airport and then merging the test results, presumably negative, with your boarding pass so that you wouldn't have to get off and quarantine on the other side. But also I thought it would be great because you would get on a plane and you would know that you're sitting with people who passed that test, which was nice to know, right?
Absolutely, and you're 100% right on. We believe that that's the ideal solution, and actually we launched a report just last week that had 3 different solutions: testing on departure, testing on arrival, or no testing. Our preference is testing before departure because there you can guarantee that everyone in the plane is COVID-free, right? Unfortunately, going back to this lack of coordination among governments, some governments, they don't want to accept the test from the other country. Look what happened at the beginning of this outbreak. Every country had to create their own test. And that's why some countries wasted some weeks, unfortunately. I was talking to a minister that I cannot name the country in Asia. He told me, Gloria, it has been unbelievable because we didn't want to accept the test from other countries. So the issue that we have, and with that, and hopefully with collaboration that's going to be fixed, is that if I have a test before I take my flight here in London, and if I go to New York, hopefully the government of the US will accept the test from London or from the UK as a valid one, and that will resolve the situation. But I 100% agree with you. You're right on.
Thank you very much. Now we've got a couple of questions that have come in that I want to put to the panel just to think about, and I'll come back to you on these. The first one is, Carl Russo's asked, can you provide an example of a business practice that could be changed right now? A low-hanging fruit. Don't answer that now, think about that one. And there's another one which is coming from Veronica Gonzalez, which is, do you think that the companies that are going to survive COVID-19 the best are the ones that were best prepared in terms of investing in social capital, relationships with communities, etc.? So let me leave those 2 questions for you to think about. I want to just bring in a couple of other people to give us a few more wider global perspectives. First of all, we have Amit Kapoor from the Institute of Competitiveness, India. And obviously India is facing some particular issues with the health, but also we've seen huge distributional issues around migrant laborers, etc. Amit, welcome to the conversation. Just tell us how India is dealing with some of these issues around reopening the economy, while also the epidemic is so rife at the moment as well. Amit.
Yeah, Michael, thanks for getting into the conversation. In fact, I would just like to pick up a thread from the Deloitte conversation. I fundamentally believe that this is the time which is going to bring about change in capitalism, and it is going to restructure the way the world actually functions. And I believe that it's already happening, and it's going to be a very strong restructuring. This pandemic has also exposed a lot of underbelly of capitalistic societies in terms of how greed has actually driven a lot of enterprises. So that would actually have to change. But having said that, if you really look at from an India perspective, I think the foremost thing that did happen was the lockdown, which was a very smart thing to happen for a country of this size of 1.3 billion people. And then a lockdown was a way that it was about flattening the curve, or you're really trying to push what do you call the timelines to really build up the health infrastructure. And this was very strongly done within the Indian system. So what did happen was that there was a clear understanding as to what were the vulnerable states, and they knew that the vulnerable states were in terms of, say, either the what do you call population, which was old, or there was lack of infrastructure. They actually started building the appropriate infrastructure. In fact, India has transformed trains as isolation units. So that did happen. So that was a very strong step that was taken. In fact, now what we are really seeing is that there is a phased opening that is actually happening. But the most important thing that did make India survive for this whole period was a very interesting scheme that the government actually had launched about 5 years back, called Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile. So Jan Dhan was the identification, the financial inclusion banking thing, or banking accounts. Aadhaar was the identification code, and mobile was access to mobile data, and so on and so forth. So what has happened is that there is a stupendous push to digital payments that has actually happened, and that has made the system survive. So there were some decisions in the past which have actually had great impact in the pandemic. But then if you really look at how businesses are opening, I think it has become imperative that businesses will have to open, because as it was said in the conversation, that you cannot actually create a social catastrophe. So there are a couple of things that are happening. Like, of course, most of the businesses are opening. Like Goa, as one of the foremost tourism location in the country, is open for traffic today morning. So hopefully that will actually gain traction. It is happening in Rajasthan. But for, say, malls and everything, there are very stringent protocols that have actually been put across. But the most important thing is contact tracing that is actually happening. So you're able to contact trace. So we have this Arogya Setu application wherein we are able to trace people who are there or whatever, and nearly 40% of the population has that application on its mobile. So we know as to like what is happening. If I actually go to a location which has a COVID case, or if I'm within 100 meters of a COVID infected person, my mobile actually alerts me that there is a COVID patient who's actually close by or whatever. So be careful, wear your mask, and so on and so forth. So those are very important things that are actually happening. But I think the larger issue is going to be that how do we get work for people? And it is going to take some time for the country to really come up. But the most important factor is that the government is saying that they're going to give free food to 800 million people in the country until December. So that's a whole huge social perspective that has actually happened. And I think for the first time, like, I am very happy that the tax money is actually going at the right direction in terms of building healthcare infrastructure, to supporting the poor and the needy and things. But I think the larger issues that emerge here are the issues of capitalism, capitalistic systems that actually exist, the greed that enterprises can actually represent at many, many points in time. I think one thing is become apparently clear, that enterprises which spend the maximum on PR are the enterprises who are the worst in corporate behavior and corporate governance behavior. Those are separate issues, but we can always get into a conversation of that sort at some point in time. So thanks for the opportunity, Michael. I hope I made some sense.
That was great. And thank you always, sir. Amit, always a provocation. Thank you on the PR fund. I think also this reminder about, we're not just talking about longer term progress. We're living through a period where this crisis has a chance of reversing progress we've made over the last couple of decades on some very basic aspects of human development and the need of some urgent response on issues like hunger. Thank you very much, Amit. I'd like to move now to Eve Roodhouse, and Eve is in charge of economic policy for Leeds City Council in the UK. Eve, thank you for joining us. I wonder, how are you wrestling with these issues around reopening the economy in Leeds and across the West Yorkshire region?
Oh gosh, where to start? I suppose just a few observations on the points made before. So the first thing is that we are very much living now the understanding of just the depth of the impact for us. And I still think that our elected politicians on a local level are coming to terms with the likely size of the unemployment numbers that we're going to be facing as a city, and what that's going to mean for us. And to the point you were just making about inequality, we are, from the data that we're seeing, we know that the unemployment numbers have gone up the most in the most disadvantaged areas, that the numbers of people on the job retention scheme that we have here in the UK are the highest in our most disadvantaged areas. So there's a kind of, we also know from the support we've put in place in the city that we've had a wave of new families and individuals coming for support that have never had to navigate the social system before. So the same as the feedback from the US in terms of some of those people that have never had to look to the social welfare system before for support. And that means that as a council, sort of almost some of the services that we had in place prior to COVID-19 for many years have not been providing the type of support that is going to be needed. Our employment and skills support, for example, has been very much focused on those furthest away from the labour market. And now we're going to be in a situation where we've got mass kind of unemployment for people that have just left the workplace. So we're just really coming to terms now with what's going to be happening over the next few months, and therefore getting our heads around needing to have an agile response from an economic recovery plan, particularly in this context of living with the virus. And in terms of reopening the economy, our immediate focus has obviously been about safety and consumer confidence in terms of the return for people into our city and district centres. And, you know, I think as it's playing out for us, and I think this is quite common across internationally as well, is that actually we're seeing people return, but at very low and gradual levels. And when they do return to kind of high street, into retail, for example, the experience isn't what they're used to. And so you're not necessarily seeing a big bounce back. So I think there's going to be some really, really significant consequences for our high streets, district centres and city centres in the UK. And collectively, again, we've got to start to get our heads around what that means for how we try and help those areas recover in the economy. We do have a very strong digital sector in Leeds, and we've also got strong health sector in Leeds. And so the other thing we're trying to do is try and get back to going back to sort of reminding people we've got strength in those areas and getting the momentum behind those sectors, whilst also facing up to some of the challenges we've got to address. So hopefully it gives you a bit of an essence of kind of where we're at, and kind of it's nice to share that actually there's quite a lot of common challenges from listening to some of the panelists with other places across the world.
Thanks, Steve. It's one of the reasons we do this is because of these common challenges, and often there's experiences can be in common across different places that maybe wouldn't normally talk to each other. So thank you. And I think there's a really important point there about we talked about different distributional impacts of this crisis. And one of those distributional impacts is going to be spatial in terms of different economic impacts in different places. And that's another aspect of this we've really got to work on. So let me come back to our panel now. Just give you a chance there were two questions. One was this idea of a question about what can business do now? What's the low-hanging fruit for business to do things differently? And then secondly, do we see the businesses that have been more socially resilient businesses more able to respond better to this crisis? Or if there's something else you want to jump in on, feel free to ignore the questions if you wish. Maybe if we go in reverse order, Sharon, would you like to lead us off on those?
Thank you, Mike. I thought, a couple of great questions. So just one of the things about low-hanging fruit, I believe that what gets measured gets done. One of the things that we introduced to drive gender diversity was to measure, sort of how many female leaders we have as a proportion of all of our leaders. And then what we should be doing now, I think, is focusing much more on, our sort of minority ethnic numbers, and how many people have we got in leadership who are, for example, Black, because we've actually made good progress around the overall BAME community, but not on the Black community. And we produce voluntarily our pay gap on ethnicity. We do it on gender as well. And you can see the progress. I mean, Anne's a great example with the 30% Club of what happens when you measure things. And I believe that companies can put that in place very quickly in terms of the ethnicity pay gap, but also having targets for leaders in different levels of people from that, that community, and really push for change. Just on that, very quickly on the, businesses that invest or are focused on social good, etc. There is quite a lot of evidence to say that they are more successful and that they do survive. And just one of the things, I think that there's quite a bit of research that's now done, because if you're a business that's focused on doing good, you're inclusive, you have more women in leadership. And there's research that shows that having more females on the board can curb excessive risk-taking by men. Apparently, businesses with a higher concentration of female directors use greater renewable energy in their businesses, so it's better for the planetary health. And there's apparently a lower incidence of corporate fraud where there are more female directors, in better quality earnings, less corporate tax aggressiveness, and they're less likely to downsize their workforce. So I think you can see some of the connections there.
Thank you, Sharon. There was a paper someone did recently using social progress index data that showed how that women-led governments were generally better in responding to the crisis as well. Just before I come to the other panelists, I just want to quickly bring in Dr. Bushra Mullah from Abu Dhabi, from the Department of Community Development. Dr. Bushra, glad you could join us. I mean, Abu Dhabi's got a range of different challenges on the economic front at this time. How are you managing the crisis in your very particular circumstances there?
Thank you, Michael Green, for the question, and thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed the discussion and very valuable input that I will benefit and go back to the government. Maybe we can propose some of those thinkings in the government. I come from a community of Department of Community Development, which is a social arm for the government on a local level. So Abu Dhabi is the capital of United Arab Emirates, and we have the social entity, which I come from, and it's on a local level and not a federal level, which is for the UAE. So in response to COVID-19, which was a bit disturbing, it did disturb the system. We had to be agile. Us working from home and the leaders and most of the sectors have been working maybe 12 to 17 or 20 hours per day. So it did affect the government entities as well as the people. So we did few interventions or actions on that. The UAE have already established a report on the UAE achievement and what actions the UAE government have taken in regards to COVID-19, and it's published on the website. I think IMF have put it on their website and OECD, if I'm not mistaken, but I can send you the link. So they have looked into the collective government at the federal level and each local entity, what they have done. So there is a full report on the response, whether it's economic response, whether it's health, whether it's social, whether it's agriculture. So we have compiled it and put it in a nice report there. Talking on the social level, first when the COVID-19 was hit, the first thing we did is that we have done a survey, a COVID-19 survey for the citizens of Abu Dhabi. And we had another survey for the families. And the third survey was for the vulnerable, we have a vulnerable group, which is we had the laborers who are in the labor camps to know what are the issues and what interventions we can have in regards to the response. So when it comes to the general COVID-19 survey, we had some data and it was great data and insight. And we found out that the trust in the government, UAE government, was very high. And the trust was in the public sector of the UAE was very high, more than the private sector, especially in the health sector. What was on the negative part and the lowdown was that the family were a bit stressed especially when working from home, and especially those who are working parents and have kids in school, that the stress level was higher. We realized that people were a bit, some of them, they were a bit concerned that they might lose their jobs. And from those surveys, several interventions came out. And one of the interventions that the government did is that we have issued a mental health support. We did an online mental health, and also for the laborers, we immediately activated a mental health support, and those who their jobs, someone mentioned here that the tourism job got affected, and lots of them in the labor camp are from, they come from tourism sector, that they are working in hotels, and hotels stopped. So the government here intervened when it's come to the social sector, knowing that we are very new. We were just established in 2018. Our strategy was only approved in February 2019. So we are very new in this area. But fortunately that we came together. We have an operational arm called MAN, which is the social contributory, and they started immediately having a contribution and funds. They did fundraising from public, from government. It was open to all. People have contributed, whether it's money, whether it's volunteering hours. Some of the hotels have provided their properties. So we used some of the hotels to accommodate people who had tested positively. So most of the hotels were reallocated to serve the health sector, that when the hospitals couldn't accommodate those big numbers. And then as well, we looked into people who lost their job and those jobs that stopped. So the government provided food, and some of them maybe needed some shelter. So shelters were provided immediately.
I'm afraid we need to wrap up now, I'm afraid, but thank you for the contribution.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're having other forums. We'd love to bring some more of this case study in. I just want to quickly come back to the rest of our panel. Sadly, Helene Gales had to leave us already, but Gloria, first of all, for you, to summarize a couple of questions, a final thought. Is there low-hanging fruit for business? Or is there this idea about the social resilience of business? Gloria, any thoughts on those questions?
Well, I fully agree with what Shannon commented on the diversity and inclusion and all of that. Now, what I also see, unfortunately, because of the situation that we're living in terms of, and I will answer perhaps just one and ask someone else to answer the others, if that's okay with you. In terms of the social capital and all of that, we see some organizations in Africa, as an example, right, that they have done quite well engaging with the communities. They have done great engaging with the government and in terms of social as well. But they might not survive to this situation because Africa doesn't have the fundings to support them. We're trying to figure out how to help them. So in that case, as the question also, it has two parts. One of what Shannon mentioned that I say fully agree 100%. But, and the women also are helping a lot in leading countries and organizations. But there are some regions that we have to just figure out how do we help them as well, to those women and that mix that they have. And in the terms of long-hanging fruit, I would love to see that, to tell you the truth. I see the digital agenda being accelerated, and touch on that. I agree with that, biometrics, payments, and all of that. We see that happening in travel and tourism. And also the sustainable agenda has been accelerated as well, because that's a top priority also for travel and tourism. And we have been working on that for years. So that's what I have to say.
Great, thank you very much. And then the last word to you, Anne.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Well, you know, I think that you can think about it in three ways. What you're doing for your people, and I completely agree with what Sharon and Gloria have said on the road to diversity. Now's the time when you're not hiring as many people, or maybe you're putting people on furlough, or maybe making people redundant, that you really look at your personnel practices and say, am I being fair? Am I being inclusive? Am I bringing the right people into my company? And am I not penalizing one section of people in my company as I restructure through this? The second thing is, what are you actually doing for your markets? And this is where if you're very dependent on small and medium businesses around the world, then doing the type of thing that we're doing in MasterCard, putting together a war chest of 250 million to invest in these businesses, and to Gloria's industry, where we're actually looking at investing 50% in women-owned and women-run businesses. So I think that's very important for the future. And then the third thing is, what are you doing for society? Because that's how you'll be measured, your social purpose. And I think on the society side, there are so many things you can do, but to actually be true to yourself. And so for us, it would be digitally including people, but also to Amit's point, we can do things as we have been doing, such as working with the World Food Programme to feed people during this point in time, because you can link many of the sustainability goals to giving, so for example, children's school meals. And we've worked with the World Food Programme all over the world so that when people have tapped their card or made a payment, they were able to contribute and pay for one child to have a school meal. And thinking of business models that work in this way that are sustainable is a good way to think about the future.
Thank you very much, Anne. I mean, we started this conversation with a poll, and it was really striking about people saw the big issue as being inequality and how that's come out, and how this crisis is a chance to address this. And I think, Anne, you've given us the slogan for the conversation, which is now is the time. If we can't address these issues now, when are we going to address them? It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all for joining us, especially to our speakers. Lots to think about. Come back again and continue the conversation, because this is evolving, this is changing. We're learning more. So it's great to be here with you all, sharing ideas about how we do it, how we take this forward. And finally, again, big thank. We wouldn't be here without our supporters and partners. Obviously, Cornitio, who partnered with Social Progress Imperative on this, but also Deloitte, Amazon Web Services, Icelandic Prime Minister's Office, and the University of Iceland. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Wow.